The night air over the western desert had finally begun to cool. For many long hours, the stones outside the tomb had carried the heavy heat of the sun. The cliffs had glowed pale gold beneath the afternoon light. The dry earth had shimmered in silence while workers moved slowly between pathways cut into the valley floor. Sandals scraped against stone. Linen clothing clung to tired bodies damp with sweat. Voices remained soft beneath the weight of the heat. But now the sun was gone. Only a faint red glow still rested far beyond the horizon where the Nile River curved through the distant green lands of Egypt. The river itself could not be seen from the burial valley. Yet everyone knew it was there beyond the desert cliffs, moving slowly through the darkness as it always had. Quiet water sliding beneath reeds and fishing boats. Water touching muddy riverbanks where sleeping villages rested under the night sky. Far away, dogs barked once in the darkness near small mud brick homes. A baby cried somewhere beside a cooking fire that had not fully gone out. Someone coughed in a narrow alley between crowded houses. Someone else turned over on a woven reed mat, searching for a cooler place to sleep. And deep in the desert hills, beneath layers of stone and dust, a sealed tomb waited in silence. The funeral had ended before sunset. The last priests had departed with careful steps, their white linen robes carrying traces of incense smoke. Workers had rolled the heavy blocking stones into place across the entrance corridor. Wet plaster had been pressed into cracks. Royal seals had been stamped softly into the pale surface while torchlight flickered across the walls. Afterward, the valley became still again. The laborers walked home slowly together in small groups. Nobody hurried now. The hardest work was over. Their shoulders ached from lifting stone. Their hands were rough with dust and rope fibers. Some men spoke quietly about bread waiting at home. Others thought only of water and sleep. A faint desert wind moved through the pathways between the tomb entrances. Then darkness settled fully across the valley. Inside the tomb, nothing moved. The final torch flames carried inside by the priests had already died. Thin trails of smoke had vanished into the stale air hours ago. What remained was complete darkness. Thick darkness that no moonlight could touch. Darkness pressing softly against painted walls and sealed wooden doors. The tomb had become its own hidden world. Deep inside rested the burial chamber itself, cut carefully into the stone beneath the mountain. The walls were painted with long rows of figures standing beneath painted stars. Boats floated across blue ceilings. Servants carried offerings of bread, onions, ducks, figs, and jars of beer. Sacred animals stood beside painted pools filled with lotus flowers. The colors remained rich even in the darkness no eyes could now see. Red ochre skin tones. Deep black outlines. Soft yellow backgrounds. Blue minerals ground into fine powder long ago by patient craftsmen sitting cross-legged inside crowded workshops near the riverbanks. Those painters had once worked beneath open windows while warm breezes carried the smell of wet clay and baking bread through the streets outside. Their fingers stained with pigment. Their backs aching after long days bent toward stone walls. Their simple lunches wrapped in cloth beside them. Bread hardening slowly in the heat. Now their work rested silently inside the sealed tomb. Near the center of the chamber stood the sarcophagus. Heavy stone surrounded it on every side. Its carved surfaces felt cool in the darkness. Hieroglyphs covered the lid in neat rows. Protective prayers wrapped around the sleeping dead like layers of cloth. Inside rested the body itself. The mummy lay beneath linen wrappings carefully folded around thin arms and quiet hands. Resin filled the air with a faint dry sweetness. Oils once rubbed into the linen still lingered softly in the sealed chamber. Gold rested across the face. Jewelry slept beside folded fingers. Amulets pressed gently against the chest beneath the wrappings. Small carved objects waited patiently in darkness beside the body. Tiny protective figures stood in rows nearby, ready to serve in the next life if called upon. Nothing moved. Hours passed slowly. The air inside the tomb remained perfectly still. No insects entered. No wind crossed the floors. Even sound itself seemed buried beneath the mountain. Outside, however, Egypt continued breathing through the night. Farmers sleeping near the Nile shifted beneath thin linen sheets. Some rested on rooftops where cooler air moved gently after sunset. Others slept inside small crowded rooms beside grandparents, children, jars of grain, baskets of onions, and folded fishing nets. A fisherman woke briefly before dawn and listened to frogs near the riverbank before drifting back to sleep. A bakery worker already stirred beside cooling ovens in a village farther south. Soon he would knead dough while stars still filled the sky. His muscles would ache before morning fully arrived. Flour dust would cling to his arms. The smell of rising bread would slowly drift into narrow streets where stray dogs wandered silently between sleeping homes. In the royal city, a tired scribe slept beside unfinished records. Reed pens rested near his hand. A single oil lamp still glowed faintly nearby, its flame shrinking lower while insects circled lazily through the warm room. Life continued everywhere beyond the sealed tomb. But inside the burial chamber, time itself seemed slower. The silence felt endless there. Even the mummy, wrapped carefully beneath layers of linen, had once belonged to the ordinary movement of daily Egyptian life. Before the funeral rituals. Before the incense and prayers. Before the long procession crossing west toward the land of the dead. Once there had been mornings beside open windows. Cool water poured into shallow basins. Sandals tied carefully before work. Meals eaten beneath shaded courtyards. Tired evenings listening to distant music drifting through warm streets. Now only stillness remained. The tomb had been prepared for many months before the burial. Stonecutters first entered the cliffs carrying copper tools, wooden mallets, baskets, ropes, and small oil lamps. Their work began early each morning before the desert heat became unbearable. Dust coated their skin. Sweat rolled down their necks. They chipped slowly into the mountain while foremen watched nearby. The sound of cutting echoed through the stone corridors day after day. Tap. Pause. Tap. Dust falling softly onto the floor. Some workers sang quietly to keep rhythm during long hours underground. Others remained silent from exhaustion. Water jars rested near the entrance tunnels where boys carried fresh supplies from outside. At midday the heat became cruel. The cliffs trapped the sun. Air inside the valley barely moved. Workers sat together in narrow strips of shade chewing onions and rough bread while flies circled lazily around them. Some men closed their eyes for a few moments before returning underground again. Then the work continued. More corridors. More chambers. Walls smoothed carefully by hand. The tomb slowly widened beneath the mountain while painters, plasterers, and scribes eventually entered after the stonecutters finished their hardest labor. They carried baskets of pigments. Fine brushes. Measuring cords. Small lamps filled with oil. Inside the cool darkness they painted eternal worlds across the walls. They painted gardens that would never dry beneath the desert sun. Pools shaded by palm trees. Boats gliding through reeds. Servants carrying endless food offerings. Musicians holding harps during quiet feasts. The tomb became a peaceful version of life itself. Not loud life. Not crowded suffering. Only calm order. Only enough bread. Enough water. Enough shade. The ancient Egyptians hoped the dead might continue peacefully in such places forever. And now the workers themselves were gone from the chamber too. Their footprints beneath the dust outside the entrance would slowly disappear beneath desert winds over the coming weeks. Inside, the painted figures waited endlessly in silence. As the hours passed after the burial, the temperature inside the tomb changed slowly. Stone released the heat it had gathered during the day. Coolness spread through the corridors. The sealed air carried faint smells of resin, cedar wood, linen cloth, and dry plaster. Far above, stars crossed over the desert cliffs. Jackals wandered carefully between rocks searching for scraps left behind by workers earlier that day. Small night insects crept through cracks in the earth. Somewhere near the valley entrance, a guard sat awake holding a spear across his knees while fighting sleep beside a weak fire. His eyes lifted often toward the quiet cliffs. He knew tomb robbers existed. Everyone knew. Even during times of strong kings and careful guards, rumors always traveled along the Nile. Hungry men spoke quietly in crowded taverns. Poor laborers whispered about hidden gold beneath the mountains. Desperate workers who could barely feed children sometimes dreamed of treasures sealed inside royal burials. But tonight no thieves came. The valley remained still. Inside the tomb, the darkness deepened further as the night slowly moved toward morning. In one storage chamber nearby stood baskets filled with grain. Jars of beer rested against walls beside folded linen garments. Wooden chairs waited untouched beneath layers of shadow. Chests held jewelry, combs, sandals, and carefully carved game boards. Objects from ordinary life. The dead were never meant to travel empty-handed into eternity. Even simple things mattered. A headrest for sleeping. A spoon carved from wood. A walking stick polished smooth by human hands. A jar for oils. A favorite necklace. A small mirror. The Egyptians believed comfort should continue after death just as it had during life beside the Nile. And so tombs became quiet homes beneath the earth. Sometimes large tombs even held tiny servant statues in great numbers. Hundreds of little figures standing patiently in rows. Their painted eyes staring outward through darkness. They carried miniature farming tools over their shoulders. Tiny hoes. Tiny baskets. Tiny picks. If work was demanded in the next world, the statues would answer instead of the dead themselves. At least that was the hope. Hours later, the deepest part of the night arrived. The desert grew colder. Outside, the guard beside the valley entrance wrapped his linen cloak tighter against the wind. The fire near him cracked softly while he stared toward the pale outline of cliffs beneath moonlight. He was tired. His feet hurt from standing through long funeral ceremonies earlier that day. Dust still covered his ankles. He thought about his wife sleeping far away near the river. He imagined cool water waiting inside a clay jar back home. He imagined warm bread in the morning. His eyelids drooped. But inside the tomb, nothing changed at all. The mummy remained untouched inside the sarcophagus. The painted walls remained unseen. The offerings remained undisturbed. The darkness remained complete. And slowly, very slowly, the first faint approach of dawn began touching the eastern edge of Egypt far beyond the western hills. Soon farmers would wake beside the Nile. Soon fishermen would untie boats from wooden posts along muddy riverbanks. Soon smoke from cooking fires would rise into pale morning skies. Soon temple servants would sweep stone floors before sunrise prayers. And deep beneath the mountain, sealed away from all sunlight and human voices, the tomb would continue waiting in endless silence while another ordinary Egyptian day quietly began above it. Morning arrived slowly across the Nile Valley. Long before sunlight touched the tops of the western cliffs, faint gray light had already begun spreading over the river water. Mist drifted low above the reeds. Palm trees stood dark and motionless against the brightening horizon while birds stirred softly among their branches. The first sounds of the day were small ones. A wooden door opening. Sandals brushing against packed earth. A donkey shifting beneath its rope harness. Somewhere near the riverbank, a woman poured water into a clay bowl while half asleep. The sound echoed softly through a narrow courtyard surrounded by mud brick walls still cool from the night air. In another home nearby, a small cooking fire crackled awake. Smoke drifted upward through a hole in the roof while children remained asleep on woven mats beside folded linen blankets. A tired baker rubbed his eyes before kneading dough in the dim early light. His hands moved slowly from long habit. Flour dust rose around him. Outside, the village was still quiet enough to hear distant frogs near the river. Across Egypt, thousands of ordinary mornings unfolded in much the same way. Fishermen prepared nets. Farmers carried tools toward fields. Scribes gathered reed pens. Laborers stretched aching backs before another day beneath the sun. The dead rested beneath the western desert while the living returned again to work. And deep inside the sealed tomb, darkness still covered everything. No sunrise entered there. No bird calls reached the burial chamber. No fresh wind crossed the painted walls. The tomb existed outside the rhythm of ordinary days now. Morning and evening no longer mattered inside the stone corridors. The air remained still and heavy. Dust settled gently in corners untouched by movement. The silence had become complete. Near the burial chamber entrance stood large jars sealed with clay stoppers. Grain waited safely inside them. Nearby rested folded linen garments prepared for eternity. Some had been woven by women who sat together months earlier beside open windows overlooking busy streets. Their fingers had worked patiently across wooden looms. Thread crossing thread. Hour after hour. Children playing nearby. Neighbors talking softly. Someone grinding grain in a nearby courtyard. The smell of bread drifting through warm afternoon air. The cloth they produced now rested forever inside the tomb. Even simple workers became connected to royal burials without ever entering the chambers themselves. Potters shaped storage jars. Woodworkers carved furniture. Farmers grew flax for linen wrappings. Boatmen carried heavy stones along the Nile. Bakers prepared food offerings placed beside the dead. An entire world of labor quietly surrounded death in ancient Egypt. The tomb itself was only the final resting place. The work behind it stretched across cities, villages, workshops, riverbanks, and fields. And now all that labor sat motionless underground. As the morning outside grew brighter, sunlight slowly reached the burial valley. The cliffs began glowing pale gold once again. Heat returned gradually to the rocks. Lizards emerged from cracks in the stone to warm themselves beneath the rising sun. The valley guards changed shifts. One tired guard walked slowly away from the tomb entrances after a sleepless night. His sandals scraped against gravel while he carried his spear loosely across one shoulder. His eyes felt dry from smoke and dust. Soon he would return home to rest during the hottest hours of the day. Another guard arrived carrying a water jar and a bundle of bread wrapped in cloth. Neither man spoke much. The valley itself encouraged silence. Every tomb entrance seemed to watch from beneath the cliffs like sealed mouths cut into the mountain. Some belonged to kings. Others to nobles, priests, or officials whose names were already fading from memory even among the living. Many tombs had rested there for generations. Some were still untouched. Others had already suffered from thieves during difficult years when royal power weakened and hungry people grew desperate. Stories traveled quietly among workers. Stories of hidden passages, broken seals, missing gold, guards accepting bribes beneath moonlight, burial chambers discovered empty except for shattered coffins and scattered linen wrappings. But this newly sealed tomb remained untouched for now. Its entrance looked smooth beneath fresh plaster. Royal seals still marked the blocking stones clearly. Nothing disturbed the pale dust gathered near the doorway. Inside, the mummy rested exactly as the priests had left it. The body had changed greatly during the long preparation for burial. Long before the funeral procession crossed toward the western desert, embalmers had worked carefully beside the river in special workshops filled with oils, linen, knives, natron salt, and incense smoke. The work was slow, quiet, routine. Not mysterious to the Egyptians themselves, who understood death as a familiar part of life beside the Nile. People died often. Workers injured during construction. Children weakened by sickness. Mothers exhausted from childbirth. Old farmers worn down by years beneath the sun. Death lived close beside ordinary existence. And so the embalmers approached their tasks calmly, with practiced hands shaped by long experience. The body had first been washed carefully with river water. Oils touched the skin. Priests spoke soft ritual words while assistants prepared linen wrappings nearby. Outside those workshops, life continued as usual. Boats moved along canals. Merchants argued over grain prices. Goats wandered dusty roads. Temple bells echoed faintly through warm air. Inside, however, the dead slowly transformed into something meant to last beyond time itself. Natron salt dried the body over many weeks. Linen strips were wrapped layer upon layer with patient care. Resin darkened the cloth. Amulets were tucked gently between folds. Protective prayers surrounded every stage of the process. The embalmers themselves were ordinary workers too. They returned home tired at night. They ate bread and onions with their families. They worried about illness, taxes, flooding seasons, and empty grain jars just like everyone else. Yet their labor connected the living world to the world of the dead more closely than almost any other profession in Egypt. Now their finished work rested silently within the tomb chamber. The mummy would remain undisturbed for many years if fortune allowed. But the tomb itself was never truly empty after burial. Even without human movement, subtle changes continued inside. The sealed air slowly dried wooden furniture. Resin hardened further in the darkness. Fine dust settled across floors. Tiny cracks sometimes formed in plaster walls as seasons passed outside the mountain. The tomb aged quietly in isolation. And beyond the cliffs, the living world moved onward without pause. By midday the Nile Valley shimmered beneath heavy heat. Farmers bent over flooded fields while insects buzzed above the water. Mud clung between tired toes. Workers wiped sweat from their foreheads using rough linen cloths already stained with dirt. The sun pressed heavily against everything. Donkeys slowed along dusty roads carrying baskets of vegetables toward market towns. Children searched for shade beneath palm trees. Even dogs rested quietly with tongues hanging from the heat. Inside crowded workshops, craftsmen continued their work despite the temperature. Potters shaped clay beside spinning wheels. Carpenters sanded wooden furniture. Stoneworkers carved statues beneath open roofs where sunlight cut across floating dust. Many of these laborers would never own fine tombs themselves. Most Egyptians expected simpler burials. A small grave, A few possessions. Some bread and beer offerings from family members. Perhaps a painted coffin if money allowed. Yet even poor workers hoped for rest after death. They hoped their names might still be spoken softly by loved ones after burial. Memory mattered deeply in ancient Egypt. To be forgotten completely felt frightening. That was one reason tomb walls carried names so carefully carved into stone. Priests repeated names during rituals. Families visited burial places with offerings during festivals. Scribes recorded generations across fragile sheets of papyrus. As long as someone remembered the dead, part of them still remained connected to the world of sunlight and river water. But eventually, almost everyone became forgotten. Even kings. Even nobles buried beneath mountains. Even those whose tombs overflowed with gold and painted treasures. Time moved quietly over all things. And inside the tomb, time now flowed differently than it did beneath the open sky. The burial chamber remained perfectly dark through the long afternoon. The painted ceiling above the sarcophagus showed stars scattered across deep blue. Golden boats sailed beneath them carrying gods through the heavens. Though unseen, the images surrounded the mummy in eternal night. The air smelled faintly dry and sweet. In one corner rested bouquets of flowers already beginning to wither slowly in the sealed atmosphere. Lotus petals curled inward. Their fragrance faded day by day. Nearby sat trays of bread offerings. Hard now. Drying further with every passing hour. Food left for the dead often remained untouched after ceremonies ended. Priests sometimes removed offerings later for temple use, but inside sealed royal burials much was left behind permanently. Bread. Garlic. Dates. Roasted duck. Beer sealed in jars. Comforts from ordinary Egyptian life brought carefully into eternity. Late in the afternoon outside, the desert wind returned. It moved softly through the burial valley carrying fine grains of sand across the stone pathways. The guards wrapped cloth over their mouths while watching dust drift against the cliffs. One younger guard stared often toward the sealed tomb entrance. He had helped during the funeral days earlier. He remembered torchlight flickering along painted corridors. He remembered priests chanting low prayers while incense smoke gathered near the ceiling. Mostly he remembered the silence afterward. That strange silence when the blocking stone slid into place and everyone understood no living person was expected to enter again. The young guards sometimes wondered what the darkness inside felt like. Not fear exactly. More like distance. A place completely separated from the sounds of life. No river birds. No market voices. No crying children. Only endless stillness beneath stone. As evening approached once more, the heat slowly weakened across Egypt. Workers began returning from fields and workshops. Boats drifted toward shore. Cooking fires appeared one by one beside homes along the Nile. The smell of lentils and bread spread through villages. Families gathered together in courtyards while daylight softened into gold. Some men soaked tired feet in cool water after long labor beneath the sun. Women folded linen garments while speaking quietly with neighbors. Children chased each other through narrow streets until darkness slowly settled. Music drifted faintly from somewhere across the river. A harp perhaps. Or a reed flute. Soft notes floating briefly through warm evening air before fading into silence. Night arrived again. Stars appeared above the western desert. And deep beneath the cliffs, hidden from the entire living world, the sealed tomb continued waiting in complete and perfect darkness. The second night after the burial settled gently over the western desert. Above the cliffs, the sky stretched wide and clear, filled with cold white stars that seemed almost close enough to touch. The dry air carried little sound across the valley now. Even the guards spoke quietly beside their fires. Their voices drifted softly between the rocks before disappearing into the darkness. Far beyond the desert, the Nile moved slowly through the night as it always had. The river never hurried. Water brushed against reeds along the banks. Fishing boats rocked gently where they had been tied for the evening. Frogs called from muddy edges hidden beneath moonlight. In small villages, cooking fires had faded into glowing embers while families rested inside warm mud brick homes. Some people still remained awake. A mother sat beside a feverish child, placing cool cloths against damp skin. An old fisherman repaired torn netting by oil lamp, his tired fingers moving carefully through the rope fibers. A temple servant swept stone floors beneath flickering torchlight before the morning prayers that would come many hours later. Egypt breathed quietly through the darkness. And beneath the silent mountain, the tomb remained sealed. Inside the corridors, the air had already become heavier than the open desert outside. The stillness pressed softly against every surface. Nothing disturbed the layers of darkness wrapped around the burial chamber. The painted figures along the walls seemed frozen in eternal movement. Servants carried baskets forever. Boats floated forever. Musicians raised hands toward invisible harps forever. Yet nothing truly moved there now except time itself, passing slowly and invisibly through the sealed rooms. Near the entrance corridor, traces of fine desert dust had already begun slipping through tiny cracks between the blocking stones. Only a little. Barely enough to notice. Thin grains settling quietly onto the floor over many hours. The desert always found ways to enter. Sand drifted across Egypt endlessly. It gathered along roads. Filled sandals. Covered sleeping mats. Pressed against windows and doorways during dry winds. Even inside royal tombs beneath mountains, the desert remained patient. Far deeper inside the burial chamber stood the great sarcophagus surrounded by offerings and painted furniture. The stone beneath it held the coolness of the mountain itself. The chamber smelled faintly of cedar wood, resin, dry linen, and old incense trapped within the sealed air. The mummy rested unchanged. Layers of linen crossed neatly over the chest and arms. Jewelry remained hidden beneath the wrappings where embalmers had carefully placed it. Protective amulets pressed softly against dried skin in the darkness. The Egyptians believed the body needed protection after death. Not only from decay, but from loneliness, from hunger, from being forgotten. The tomb itself became a shelter against these fears. Everything inside had purpose. The painted walls guided the dead safely through the next world. Food offerings prevented eternal hunger. Statues provided servants. Spells carved into stone guarded against danger beyond death. Even the placement of objects mattered. Careful order filled the burial chamber. Nothing had been left carelessly behind. The workers who prepared the tomb understood this deeply. Many of them had spent years helping create houses for the dead while living simple lives themselves beside the Nile. Some belonged to entire villages built for royal laborers. One such village rested not far from the burial valleys themselves. Narrow streets wound between mud brick homes crowded closely together beneath the desert cliffs. The houses were small, warm, and often filled with the smells of cooking grain, oil smoke, sweat, and damp clay jars. Stonecutters lived there. Painters. Plaster workers. Scribes. Men who carried water and tools into the tombs each morning before sunrise. Their work was difficult. During the hottest months, the air inside unfinished tomb corridors became thick and painful to breathe. Oil lamps smoked heavily in narrow chambers. Dust coated throats and eyes. Workers often emerged exhausted into the blinding sunlight outside. At night they returned home tired beyond words. Some ate quietly before sleeping almost immediately on reed mats spread across cool floors. Others sat beneath the stars with neighbors while children chased each other through the streets. Arguments happened sometimes. So did laughter. People worried constantly about grain supplies, injuries, illness, and wages delayed by distant officials. Yet despite hard lives, many workers took pride in their labor beneath the mountains. The tombs would outlive them. Long after their own names disappeared, the painted walls and carved chambers might still remain hidden inside the cliffs. And now one more completed tomb rested silently in the darkness. Hours passed underground without change. Outside, the night deepened further. The guards near the valley entrance added more wood to their fires. Flames cracked softly while shadows shifted across the stone walls behind them. One older guard rubbed aching knees beneath his linen kilt and stared upward toward the stars. He had worked in the burial valleys since youth. He had seen many funerals. Some grand and crowded with priests, musicians, incense, and gold-covered coffins. Others smaller and quieter. He had watched grieving families leave flowers near sealed entrances before walking slowly back toward the living world beside the river. He had also seen tomb robbers. Not often, but enough. Usually desperate men. Thin men with hungry children. Former laborers who knew the valleys too well. Sometimes they came years after burials, waiting until guards grew careless or governments weakened. They searched for jewelry, gold masks, oils, carved statues, anything that could be traded for bread or grain. The old guard understood their desperation even while hating their work. Egypt could be cruel during difficult years. When the Nile flood failed, hunger spread quickly. Grain prices climbed. Workers sold furniture, tools, even clothing to survive. Families crowded together sharing what little food remained. In such times, sealed tombs filled with treasures became dangerous temptations beneath the mountains. But tonight no thieves crossed the valley. Only wind moved between the cliffs. Inside the tomb, silence continued without interruption. Somewhere deeper within the burial chambers stood wooden chests filled with clothing prepared for eternity. Fine linen folded carefully. Sandals placed side by side. Decorative collars made from beads and gold. These objects once belonged to everyday life beneath the sun. A necklace worn during festivals beside the Nile. Sandals carried across palace courtyards. A wooden chair where someone once rested after long afternoons listening to distant music and watching servants pour cool water into cups. Now such objects belonged only to darkness. The Egyptians believed the dead still needed familiar comforts. Life after death was imagined not as something strange and distant, but as a continuation of ordinary existence made peaceful and complete. Fields would remain green forever. The river would never fail. Bread would always be fresh. Bodies would remain healthy and strong. Shade would always wait nearby during the hottest hours. For ordinary workers whose real lives often contained exhaustion and uncertainty, such dreams carried deep comfort. Even poor families sometimes placed simple possessions into graves. A comb. A bowl. A fishing hook. A small jar of oil. Tiny offerings carried hope into eternity. And beneath the western mountain, one carefully prepared tomb now held enough possessions to fill many homes. Night insects clicked softly outside among the rocks. The moon crossed slowly overhead. Far away along the Nile, another day quietly approached. Soon bakers would wake before dawn. Soon fishermen would push boats into dark water while stars still reflected across the river surface. Soon laborers would begin walking dusty roads toward fields and workshops once more. The living world never stopped for long in Egypt. Yet the tomb remained untouched by those rhythms. Inside, there was no dawn. No cool morning breeze. No sound of sandals crossing courtyards. Only the endless stillness surrounding the dead. As hours drifted onward, tiny details inside the burial chamber slowly changed in ways no living eyes could witness. Oil residue hardened further along the rims of ceremonial jars. Lotus flowers dried more completely. Wooden furniture released faint scents into the sealed air. Resin darkened slightly where it touched linen wrappings. The tomb aged quietly from the very first night after burial. And time outside continued its steady movement too. Children grew older beside the Nile. Flood seasons rose and fell. Officials changed. Harvests succeeded or failed. Workers died and new workers took their places beneath the desert cliffs. Years would eventually pass above the sealed chamber like drifting sand. But for now, only 2 nights had gone by since the funeral procession crossed into the valley. The memory of the burial still remained fresh among those who attended. Priests still remembered their chants. Laborers still remembered the weight of the blocking stones. The guards still remembered torchlight glowing briefly inside the corridors before darkness swallowed everything forever. Near midnight, the desert wind strengthened slightly. Sand whispered across stone outside the tomb entrance. The young guard from the previous evening pulled his cloak tighter while staring toward the cliffs. He imagined the sealed burial chamber beneath all that rock and darkness. Sometimes he wondered whether the dead felt loneliness. The priests said no. The tomb contained everything needed for eternity. Yet the guard thought often about silence itself. He knew silence from long night watches in the valley. Hours where only wind and distant animal cries disturbed the darkness. Even that silence sometimes felt heavy to him. How much heavier must the silence inside the tomb be? He stared at the stars again. Then lowered his eyes toward the pale outline of the sealed entrance. Nothing moved there. No sound emerged. Only stillness beneath the mountain while Egypt slept quietly beside the slow black waters of the Nile. Toward the final hours of the night, the desert became colder than many people imagined. During the day, the western cliffs held heat like ovens beneath the burning sun. The rocks shimmered. The pathways between the tombs seemed to glow white beneath the brightness. Men carrying stone or water often wrapped cloth over their heads to protect themselves from the endless glare. But before dawn, the warmth vanished quickly. Cold air slipped through the valleys and settled among the cliffs. Guards warming themselves beside small fires held their hands close to the flames while looking east toward the hidden river beyond the darkness. The stars above Egypt remained sharp and clear. No clouds moved across the sky. Only silence and the faint whisper of wind over sand. Inside the sealed tomb, however, the temperature barely changed at all. The mountain protected the burial chamber from the sharp differences between day and night outside. The stone held its own quiet coolness. The air remained dry and still around the sarcophagus and painted walls. The tomb had become separated from ordinary time. No sunrise touched it. No seasons entered fully. Even the sounds of storms or festivals in distant cities could never reach those deep chambers beneath the earth. The burial spaces rested alone in their darkness. In the final hours before dawn, a faint smell of smoke drifted across the valley outside. One of the guards had added fresh wood to his fire. The scent mixed with dust and cold stone while the men sat quietly together trying to stay awake. One guard spoke softly about his village beside the Nile. He described the date palms behind his home. The narrow irrigation canals running through nearby fields. The sound of women grinding grain before sunrise each morning. The others listened without much conversation. Tiredness covered them all. One younger man rubbed sore shoulders from lifting heavy stones during the funeral days earlier that week. Another slowly chewed dry bread while staring at the cliffs. Their lives were ordinary ones. Long work. Simple food. Heat during the day. Sleep at night beside family members crowded together inside small rooms. Most guards owned little beyond clothing, tools, and a few household objects. Some hoped their children might someday become scribes instead of laborers. A scribe's life looked easier from a distance. Shade. Ink. Papyrus. Sitting rather than lifting. But even scribes grew tired. Even scribes worried about food prices and illness. No life beside the Nile escaped hardship completely. Far away, the river moved quietly through the darkness while early fishermen already began preparing for the morning. A few small boats slipped into the water before dawn. Men pushed away from muddy banks using long wooden poles while mist hovered low across the river surface. Nets rested in piles near their feet. Oil lamps glowed weakly at the bows of the boats before slowly fading against the growing gray light in the east. The fishermen spoke little. Morning work always began quietly. They understood the river through long habit. They knew where reeds thickened, where fish gathered, where crocodiles sometimes rested silently near the shore. The Nile fed Egypt. Without it, the villages, farms, workshops, temples, and royal cities would never have survived the surrounding desert. Every loaf of bread, every field of grain, every linen garment and clay jar depended in some way upon the slow movement of river water through the valley. And every tomb beneath the western cliffs depended on it too. The workers who built burial chambers ate bread grown beside the Nile. The painters mixed pigments using water carried from the riverbanks. Boats transported limestone, wood, oils, and food north and south across Egypt for generations. Even the dead rested because the river allowed the living world to continue. At last, the first faint line of dawn appeared far beyond the eastern horizon. The guards stood slowly, stretching stiff legs. Another day was beginning. Birds awakened among the reeds near the riverbanks. Smoke rose once again from village cooking fires. Bakers shaped dough beneath dim light while donkeys brayed impatiently in crowded courtyards. The living world returned to motion. But inside the tomb, darkness continued unchanged. The burial chamber remained hidden beneath layers of stone while the painted figures along the walls stayed locked forever in silent movement. One painted servant carried geese. Another poured wine. Another guided cattle through fields beneath a painted sky. Scenes from ordinary Egyptian life covered the walls because ordinary life itself mattered deeply to the people who created the tombs. The afterlife was not imagined as endless excitement or endless mystery. It was imagined as comfort. Cool water after heat. Rest after labor. Food after hunger. Shade after long hours beneath the sun. The paintings reflected the peaceful continuation of daily existence along the Nile. Even wealthy officials and nobles often asked artists to show familiar activities inside their tombs. Fishing. Farming. Family gatherings. Banquets. Gardens. Servants preparing meals. Musicians playing softly during evening feasts. The tomb became a quiet memory of life made eternal. And now those painted memories surrounded the dead in silence. As morning brightened outside, workers slowly returned to the burial valleys for ordinary maintenance and labor unrelated to the newly sealed tomb. Some swept pathways clear of drifting sand. Others carried supplies toward unfinished chambers deeper within the cliffs where new tombs were still being carved for future burials. The work of death in Egypt never truly stopped. One funeral ended. Another tomb began. Stonecutters lifted tools onto tired shoulders while walking toward the cliffs beneath the rising sun. Their sandals scraped softly against gravel. Dust already coated the hems of their linen garments. Many of these workers lived carefully measured lives. Wake before sunrise. Eat bread and onions. Work beneath heat and stone. Return home exhausted. Sleep. Then begin again. Some suffered injuries that never fully healed. Damaged backs. Crushed fingers. Aching knees from years spent crouched inside narrow corridors. Medical care existed, but simple workers rarely enjoyed long rest. Families depended upon wages and grain distributions. Missing too many days of labor could bring hunger quickly. Yet despite hardship, moments of peace still appeared in their lives. Cool evenings beside rooftops. Children laughing in narrow streets. Music during festivals. Fresh bread pulled from ovens. The smell of river water drifting through open windows at night. Ancient Egypt was not only kings and monuments. It was mostly tired people living ordinary days beside the Nile. And deep beneath the western mountain, the tomb quietly preserved objects from one such life now transformed into eternity. Inside a nearby side chamber rested furniture arranged carefully against the walls. Wooden stools. Boxes with carved lids. A bed frame prepared for the next world. Some pieces had been made from imported cedar wood carried across great distances by traders and sailors. Others came from local workshops where craftsmen sat cross-legged on dusty floors shaping wood beneath open roofs. The furniture still carried faint smells of oil and resin. Nearby stood jars filled with perfumed ointments meant to comfort the dead forever. Their sealed lids trapped scents of flowers, herbs, and oils gathered from many places across Egypt and beyond. Nothing inside the tomb had been chosen carelessly. Every object reflected labor. Some farmer somewhere had grown the flax used for linen wrappings. Some miner had cut stone for amulets beneath harsh desert conditions. Some merchant had guided donkeys loaded with supplies across dusty roads. Some potter had shaped offering jars while sweating beside hot kilns. The tomb held the work of countless ordinary lives gathered together in darkness. By midday, the heat outside returned heavily once again. Sunlight burned across the cliffs. Workers paused often to drink water from clay jars kept in shaded areas. Some sat silently beneath rough shelters during short rest periods while flies buzzed lazily around them. The young guard from the night shift finally walked home through the hot streets of the workers' village. His eyes felt heavy from exhaustion. Sweat darkened his clothing. As he passed through the narrow lanes, he smelled lentils cooking somewhere nearby. Children ran barefoot through the dust. A woman shook sand from woven mats hanging outside her doorway. Life continued simply. He entered his small home quietly so as not to wake everyone inside. His wife slept beside their youngest child near the rear wall. Another child rested beneath a thin linen sheet on the floor nearby. The guard drank deeply from a cool water jar before lying down to sleep. Outside, the heat pressed against the village roofs. Inside the sealed tomb beneath the mountain, nothing moved at all. The darkness remained complete. The mummy rested untouched within layers of linen and gold. The painted stars above the burial chamber continued shining silently across the unseen ceiling. And somewhere far beyond the western cliffs, the Nile flowed onward beneath the afternoon sun just as it had long before the tomb was sealed, and just as it would continue long after every living person connected to the burial had vanished into memory themselves. The afternoon moved slowly across the Nile Valley. Heat shimmered above the fields. The air itself seemed heavy enough to touch. Farmers bent quietly over irrigation canals while muddy water slipped between rows of grain under the bright sun. Sweat rolled down tired backs. Flies gathered around damp skin and working animals. Most labor slowed during the hottest part of the day. Even donkeys stood quietly in narrow strips of shade beside walls and palm trees. Dogs slept beneath carts. Merchants covered baskets with cloth to protect food from dust and insects. The entire land seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the weight of the sun. Far from the river, beyond the green fields and crowded villages, the western cliffs stood silent and pale against the empty desert sky. Inside the sealed tomb, cool darkness remained unchanged. The burial chamber held its silence carefully, as though protecting it. No footsteps crossed the stone floors. No torchlight touched the painted walls. No human voice entered the corridors. Only stillness lived there now. Near the sarcophagus, small offering tables rested exactly where priests had placed them during the funeral rites. The bread left upon them had already grown harder in the dry air. Tiny cracks formed along the crusts. Fruit slowly shrank inward as moisture disappeared day by day into the sealed atmosphere. The Egyptians understood that earthly things changed with time. Flowers wilted. Food dried. Bodies weakened. Buildings cracked beneath sun and wind. That was one reason they worked so carefully to preserve the dead through mummification and tomb rituals. They hoped order might survive against the slow-wearing force of time. And so they wrapped bodies. Painted walls. Carved prayers into stone. Sealed chambers beneath mountains. Yet even the strongest tomb remained part of the earth itself. Quiet changes had already begun from the moment the entrance closed forever. Dust settled. Wood aged. Air thickened. Silence deepened. Outside, life continued with no pause at all. Near the riverbanks, children carried water jars larger than their arms seemed able to hold. Women sat together grinding grain between heavy stones while speaking softly about household troubles, neighbors, and rising prices at the market. The sound of grinding grain filled many Egyptian homes from morning until evening. Stone against stone. Slow circles repeated endlessly. Flour dust covering hands and clothing. Bread was life beside the Nile. Without bread, hunger arrived quickly. Poor families often ate simple meals day after day. Rough bread. Onions. Beans. Perhaps fish if the river had been generous. Perhaps dates or figs during better seasons. Meat remained rare for many workers except during festivals or special occasions connected to temples and religious celebrations. Inside wealthier homes, meals could be larger and more varied. Roasted duck. Honey cakes. Wine cooled in shaded rooms. Fresh vegetables carried from fertile gardens beside canals. The objects placed within the tomb reflected such comforts. Beautiful cups rested inside wooden chests. Decorated jars stood against the chamber walls. Painted scenes showed servants carrying trays overflowing with food and drink. The dead were never meant to suffer hunger in the next world. As afternoon slowly faded outside, workers inside unfinished tombs deeper within the cliffs continued their labor by dim oil lamps. The sound of tools echoed softly underground. Tap. Scrape. Tap. Dust floated through narrow corridors while men crouched beside rough stone walls. Their skin glistened with sweat despite the coolness underground. Some workers tied cloth across their mouths to keep dust from filling their throats. A foreman moved slowly among them checking measurements scratched onto plaster surfaces. Nearby, A scribe recorded supplies and work progress using reed pens dipped carefully into black ink. Even in burial valleys, life depended on schedules and routine. Stone deliveries, food distributions, tool repairs, worker attendance. Nothing large in Egypt happened without careful organization carried by ordinary hands. And always beneath that labor stood the desert itself. Dry, patient, endless. The cliffs watched generation after generation come and disappear. Kings died. Officials vanished. Families faded into memory. But the mountains remained. Inside one newly sealed tomb beneath those cliffs, the dead rested while the world above continued changing hour by hour. As the afternoon softened toward evening, shadows slowly lengthened across the Nile Valley. The heat weakened. Workers began returning home along dusty roads carrying tools over tired shoulders. Fishermen repaired nets beside canals while children gathered around them asking questions in sleepy voices. The smell of evening meals drifted through villages. Lentils boiling in clay pots. Fresh bread baking inside small ovens. Smoke rising gently into the golden light. In one narrow courtyard, an elderly woman sat weaving baskets while listening to distant music carried faintly across the rooftops. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple reed flute. The notes moved softly through the warm air before fading. Music in Egypt often belonged to evenings. After labor. After heat. After the hardest part of the day had finally passed. Families gathered together in small open spaces between homes while daylight slowly disappeared. Some spoke quietly. Others simply rested in silence, too tired for conversation. The stars would come soon enough. And with them, cooler air. Inside the sealed tomb, however, there was no evening. No soft sunset glow touched the burial chamber. No sounds from the villages reached the painted corridors. Darkness covered everything equally and completely. The mummy remained motionless beneath layers of linen carefully folded by embalmers many days earlier. Resin still clung faintly to the wrappings. Gold rested quietly over the face. Nearby stood small statues shaped like servants and workers. Tiny figures carrying baskets. Tiny figures holding farming tools. Tiny figures ready to labor eternally in place of the dead. Many had been painted quickly by craftsmen working long hours inside crowded workshops. Their hands moved from habit learned over many years. Paint brushes dipped into mineral pigments. Clay lamps smoking beside them. Sweat gathering beneath linen headcloths during hot afternoons. Those craftsmen likely never imagined how long their work might survive beneath the mountains. Most people in Egypt expected little permanence in life. Floodwaters came and went. Homes required constant repair. Wood rotted. Clothing wore thin. Even names slowly disappeared after enough years passed. But tombs sometimes endured. Hidden from sunlight and rain, sealed beneath stone, they preserved moments of ordinary existence in stillness. A painted loaf of bread. A painted garden. A painted servant carrying water jars. Simple scenes waiting silently in darkness. As evening finally deepened outside, the burial valley cooled once more. The guards lit their fires again. Wind moved softly between the cliffs carrying traces of sand along the pathways. One guard walked slowly past the newly sealed entrance while holding a small oil lamp near the ground. He paused there briefly. The fresh plaster seals still looked untouched. No footprints disturbed the dust. Everything remained secure. The guard listened for a moment although he knew he would hear nothing. Stillness pressed against the mountain. He sometimes wondered whether the dead dreamed. Priests spoke often of the soul traveling beyond earthly life, of judgment, of fields beyond death where grain grew endlessly beside peaceful waters. But for the guards who spent long nights beside sealed tombs, death often felt quieter than the priests described. More silent, more distant, like a room sealed forever beyond reach. The guard lowered his lamp and continued walking through the valley. Above him, stars slowly filled the sky. The cliffs glowed pale beneath moonlight. And deep underground, the tomb continued resting inside perfect darkness while another calm Egyptian night spread gently across the land beside the slow-moving Nile River. The night settled softly over Egypt once again. Along the Nile, the final cooking fires dimmed one by one beside village homes. Smoke drifted upward through the warm darkness before disappearing into the quiet sky. Dogs wandered slowly through narrow streets searching for scraps near doorways. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried briefly before falling silent again. Most people had gone to sleep. Laborers stretched out on woven reed mats after long days beneath the sun. Fishermen rested beside bundled nets smelling faintly of river water and wet reeds. Farmers slept with aching shoulders while cool night air finally touched skin burned by the afternoon heat. Inside crowded homes, entire families often shared the same small rooms. Children slept beside grandparents. Clay jars lined the walls. Baskets hung from wooden pegs. The scent of bread, smoke, sweat, and dust lingered gently in the still air. Many rooftops held sleeping figures as well. During hot seasons, people climbed stairs after sunset carrying blankets and mats so they could rest beneath the open sky where cooler breezes moved softly through the night. Above them, stars stretched endlessly over the valley. The same stars painted inside tomb ceilings beneath the western mountains. And deep below those mountains, one sealed burial chamber remained untouched in darkness. The air inside the tomb had grown very dry now. The moisture left behind from flowers, food offerings, oils, and human breath during the funeral ritual slowly disappeared into the stone chambers. Everything settled into stillness. The painted walls waited silently. One long wall showed boats traveling across calm water beneath rows of stars. Another showed servants bringing baskets overflowing with onions, figs, grain, and folded linen garments. There were musicians too, frozen forever with delicate fingers lifted toward harps and flutes. The paintings were not hurried work. Artists spent many careful days shaping them. First came rough outlines sketched across smooth plaster surfaces. Then colors were added slowly using pigments ground from minerals and earth. Red from ochre. Blue from crushed stone. Black from soot and charcoal. The painters often worked crouched for hours beneath smoky oil lamps while heat gathered inside the unfinished chambers. Dust coated their arms. Their knees ached from sitting on stone floors. Outside the tombs, their ordinary lives continued much like everyone else's. Some returned home each evening to wives preparing lentils over small fires. Others stopped briefly at crowded beer houses where workers sat together speaking quietly about wages, taxes, or rumors from distant cities along the Nile. Many artists belonged to families of craftsmen stretching back generations. Fathers taught sons how to hold brushes steadily, how to mix pigments, how to draw clean black lines around painted figures. The work required patience more than speed. And now their careful labor slept beneath the mountain in eternal darkness. Hours passed. The valley guards moved slowly along their routes beneath moonlight. Their sandals brushed against loose gravel while spears rested across tired shoulders. Sometimes they paused beside older tomb entrances where wind had gathered small drifts of sand against the stone. The desert never stopped moving. Even on calm nights, fine grains traveled quietly through the air. A little sand entered every crack eventually. A little dust covered every surface. Time itself often felt like drifting sand in Egypt. Slow. Constant. Impossible to hold back forever. Inside the burial chamber, the mummy remained wrapped in layer after layer of linen. Some strips had been soaked in resin until they hardened slightly around the body. Others still carried faint traces of perfume oils prepared by embalmers during the long burial process. The embalmers worked with calm familiarity. Death was not unusual to them. They had seen old bodies weakened by age. Young workers crushed during labor. Mothers taken by sickness. Priests worn thin by long years inside temple walls. Life beside the Nile could be beautiful, but it was often fragile too. The river brought abundance when floods were good. But poor floods meant hunger. Illness spread quickly through crowded homes during certain seasons. Flies gathered near standing water. Fevers moved through villages. Some people recovered. Others quietly disappeared from daily life and were carried west toward the land of the dead. Funerals happened often enough that mourning became woven naturally into Egyptian existence. Neighbors brought food to grieving families. Priests spoke prayers. Bodies crossed the Nile toward western cemeteries beneath the setting sun. Then life slowly continued. Fields still needed planting. Bread still needed baking. Children still needed feeding. And deep inside tombs beneath the cliffs, silence slowly gathered around the dead. Near midnight, a faint wind crossed the burial valley. The guards pulled linen cloaks tighter while fires flickered low beside them. One older guard stared toward the stars while rubbing dust from tired eyes. He remembered earlier years when he himself had worked carrying stone inside unfinished tombs. Those days had been hard. Long hours underground. Heavy baskets cutting into sore shoulders. The endless sound of chisels striking rock. Yet he sometimes missed the companionship of the workers. Men singing softly together during difficult labor. Shared bread during rest periods. Quiet laughter beneath rough shade shelters while waiting for the afternoon heat to weaken. Now most nights belonged only to silence and watching. He looked toward the newly sealed tomb again. Everything appeared calm. No movement. No disturbed sand. Only the pale outline of stone beneath moonlight. The guard understood that inside the tomb rested objects more valuable than anything he would ever own. Gold jewelry. Decorated furniture. Fine linen. Beautiful carved boxes. Yet strangely, when he imagined the burial chamber, it was not treasure he pictured most clearly. It was the stillness. The deep silence beneath the mountain. That silence felt heavier than gold. Far away beside the Nile, temple priests had already begun preparing for the next day's rituals. Some swept courtyards beneath torchlight while others arranged offerings near statues hidden within dark inner chambers. Temples in Egypt rarely slept completely. Sacred fires needed tending. Floors required cleaning. Offerings had to remain fresh. The gods were honored through routine just as families were sustained through routine. Everything depended on repeated daily actions. Sweeping floors. Grinding grain. Repairing fishing nets. Lighting lamps. Carrying water. Even the tomb itself represented routine carried beyond death. The dead would continue receiving offerings through ritual memory. Priests might return during festivals. Family members could visit with flowers, bread, or prayers while generations still remembered the name buried within the mountain. But memory faded slowly with time. Children grew old themselves. Families moved away. Political troubles changed cities and officials. Eventually some tombs became quiet even in the minds of the living. Only the desert remained faithful. The cliffs remembered. The stone corridors endured. The painted walls waited silently beneath drifting sand. As the night deepened further, jackals moved carefully through rocky areas near the edge of the valley. Their paws crossed softly over dust and loose stone. Occasionally one stopped and lifted its head toward the wind. The ancient Egyptians watched such animals closely. Jackals were connected in many minds with death and cemeteries because they wandered so often among the desert burials west of the Nile. Priests even shaped the god Anubis with the head of a jackal, guardian of tombs and guide of the dead. Inside the sealed burial chamber, painted images of protective gods watched silently from the walls. Some carried staffs. Some held strange sacred symbols. Some spread protective wings around the dead. Their painted eyes remained open forever in the darkness. The Egyptians believed these images carried real power. Words and pictures mattered deeply in their world. A carved prayer was not merely decoration. A painted offering was not simply paint. Images themselves helped sustain eternal life within the tomb. That was why workers painted food so carefully. Bread with cracked crusts. Fish with silver scales. Clusters of grapes. Bowls filled with figs. The dead should never hunger. Even in darkness. Even in silence. Beyond the western cliffs, the Nile reflected pale moonlight while slow water continued moving north through sleeping Egypt. Hours later, the first faint coolness before dawn began touching the valley once more. Soon bakers would rise. Soon farmers would walk toward the fields. Soon children would wake beside warm cooking fires. Another ordinary day would begin beside the river. But beneath the mountain, inside the sealed tomb untouched by sunlight or morning sounds, the darkness would remain exactly the same as it had been the moment the final torch went out after burial. Before sunrise, Egypt belonged to quiet sounds. The air beside the Nile felt cool for a short while then, almost gentle after the heavy heat of the previous day. Mist drifted over canals and low fields. Palm leaves moved softly in the faint breeze. Somewhere near the riverbanks, birds began calling to one another across the gray morning light. In villages along the water, people slowly stirred awake. A woman stepped carefully across a dark courtyard carrying a clay lamp whose flame trembled in the cool air. Nearby, someone yawned behind a mud brick wall. A child still half asleep rubbed dust from tired eyes while listening to the first noises of the morning. The day always began early in Egypt. Those who waited too long lost the precious coolness before sunrise. Bakers already worked beside ovens glowing red in the darkness. Their arms were dusted white with flour. Dough rested beneath cloth coverings while the smell of rising bread slowly drifted through the narrow streets outside. Fishermen pushed boats into the river using long wooden poles. Water rippled softly around them. Nets lay piled at their feet. One old fisherman paused for a moment before dawn fully arrived and simply listened to the river moving beside him. He had known that sound his entire life. The gentle wash of Nile water against wood and reeds. The distant cry of birds. The creaking of rope and boat hulls. Such sounds became part of a person after many years. And far beyond the river, deep beneath the western cliffs, the sealed tomb remained untouched by morning. No dawn entered there. No birdsong. No smell of baking bread or river mist. Only darkness resting endlessly against painted stone. Inside the burial chamber, the cool air held steady around the sarcophagus. The walls seemed almost alive with silent images. Painted servants carried baskets forever through painted gardens beneath painted trees heavy with fruit. The Egyptians filled tombs with scenes of life because life itself mattered deeply to them. Not grand adventures. Not endless excitement. Simple life. Quiet meals. Music drifting through evening courtyards. Shade beneath trees. Fresh water after work. Family members gathered together at sunset. These ordinary comforts appeared again and again across tomb paintings because they represented peace. The dead hoped to continue such peaceful existence forever. Near one wall stood a painted image of workers harvesting grain. Bent backs beneath the sun. Bundles tied carefully by hand. Men carrying sacks toward storage buildings. The artist who painted the scene likely understood such labor personally. Even craftsmen working inside royal tombs often came from farming families. During flood seasons when fields disappeared beneath rising Nile water, some men worked on royal building projects instead. Life in Egypt followed the rhythm of the river. When the floods arrived, water spread slowly across the valley floor, leaving rich dark soil behind as it retreated. Farmers watched the flood carefully each year. Too little water brought fear. Too much water brought destruction. Everything depended upon balance. And so the Nile shaped not only farming, but taxes, labor schedules, food supplies, and even royal power itself. Inside the sealed tomb, however, the river existed only through painted images and symbolic offerings. Blue water flowed eternally across wall paintings. Boats floated forever beneath painted reeds. Fish leaped endlessly through painted marshes. But no real water entered the chamber. Only dry silence remained. Outside, the burial valley slowly brightened beneath the rising sun. The cliffs turned gold. Long shadows stretched across the pathways between tomb entrances. Workers began arriving again carrying tools, baskets, ropes, and water jars. Some greeted each other with tired nods before disappearing into unfinished chambers deeper within the mountains. The sound of labor slowly returned to the valley. Stone scraping against stone. Muted hammer strikes. Voices echoing faintly underground. Yet around the newly sealed tomb, quiet still remained. Fresh plaster covered the entrance neatly. The royal seals pressed into it remained untouched. Sand had gathered lightly along the lower edges during the night wind. A young worker passing nearby glanced toward the sealed doorway for only a moment before continuing on his way. He tried not to think too much about the dead. Most laborers did not. Death was familiar enough already. Many workers had lost brothers, children, or parents long before old age arrived. Illness moved quickly through crowded villages. Injuries from labor sometimes healed poorly. Hunger weakened bodies during difficult years. People mourned deeply, but they also learned to continue living beside grief. The Nile kept flowing. Fields still needed tending. Taxes still needed paying. And so life moved onward even after funerals ended. Inside the tomb, the mummy rested in complete stillness. The wrappings around the body had been folded carefully by many hands. Some linen strips crossed each other with almost perfect neatness. Resin darkened portions of the cloth into deep brown shades beneath the gold funerary mask. Jewelry hidden within the wrappings waited silently in darkness. Small protective amulets shaped like sacred symbols rested near the chest and throat. Tiny carved stones once touched by warm living hands now lay cold beneath layers of linen. The embalmers believed these objects carried power into the next world. Protection mattered deeply in death. The tomb itself acted as protection too. Heavy stone guarded the chambers. Magic guarded the spirit. Paintings guarded memory. Yet beyond all those protections waited time itself, patient and endless. Years would slowly pass over the mountain. Dust would gather. Kingdoms would change. Children not yet born would someday walk the riverbanks where mourners had once wept during the funeral procession. but for now, the burial remained recent enough that memories still felt close. Priests still recalled the scent of incense inside the chamber. Workers still remembered lifting the blocking stones into place. Relatives still mourned quietly beside household shrines and family gatherings. The dead had not yet become distant. Near midday, heat returned heavily across the valley. Workers paused often in shaded areas to drink water from clay jars cooled with damp cloth. Some sat silently chewing onions and coarse bread while sweat dried across dusty skin. A stonecutter rubbed his swollen hands carefully before returning underground. Another worker closed his eyes briefly against exhaustion. Life in the burial valleys demanded endurance. Even the artists suffered physically despite their beautiful work. Hours spent crouching inside narrow chambers damaged backs and knees. Lamp smoke stung eyes and lungs. Fine dust settled into clothing and hair. Yet many craftsmen still cared deeply about the quality of their work. A clean line mattered. A carefully painted eye mattered. A prayer carved correctly into stone mattered. Mistakes inside tombs could feel dangerous, almost disrespectful toward the dead and the gods alike. Inside the sealed chamber, their careful labor remained perfectly preserved for now. No sunlight faded the colors. No wind wore away the plaster. The painted figures waited endlessly beneath darkness. As afternoon stretched onward, the villages beside the Nile slowed beneath the heat once more. Children slept in shaded corners. Merchants rested beneath woven awnings. Goats stood motionless near walls. Even conversation seemed quieter during the hottest hours. Only insects buzzed steadily through the heavy air. Inside one riverside home, an elderly man sat alone repairing a reed basket. His fingers moved slowly with age. Outside his doorway, the Nile shimmered brightly beneath the sun. He remembered many funerals from his lifetime. Friends carried west across the river. Neighbors wrapped in linen. Small graves for children taken too soon by fever. Death had always existed beside daily life in Egypt. Not hidden away. Not distant. People prepared for it while still alive. Tombs were planned years ahead. Coffins ordered. Funerary texts copied carefully onto papyrus or painted onto walls. The journey after death mattered greatly. And beneath the western cliffs, one newly sealed tomb now waited silently for eternity to begin. By evening, cooler winds finally returned across the valley. The workers slowly departed. The sounds of tools faded. Shadows lengthened across the stone pathways. One by one, the tomb entrances disappeared into darkness again beneath the growing night sky. The guards lit small fires. Stars emerged overhead. And deep underground, beneath layers of rock untouched by moonlight or wind, the burial chamber remained exactly as it had been left after the funeral. Still. Silent. Waiting endlessly in darkness while Egypt settled once more into another calm night beside the slow black waters of the Nile River. The fire beside the valley guard burned low during the middle hours of the night. Thin streams of smoke drifted upward between the cliffs before disappearing beneath the stars. The guard sat quietly with his knees drawn close against the cool desert air. A clay cup rested near his feet. The warmth inside it had already faded. Around him, the burial valley remained silent. The entrances to the tombs appeared pale beneath moonlight, cut into the stone cliffs like quiet doorways leading nowhere. Some entrances were old and worn from generations of drifting sand. Others remained sharp and clean, their carvings still clear against the rock. The newly sealed tomb looked untouched. No footprints crossed the dust near the entrance. No movement disturbed the stillness. Only wind traveled there now. Far beyond the western desert, the Nile moved softly through sleeping Egypt. Moonlight shimmered faintly across the water. Boats tied along the riverbanks rocked gently against wooden posts while fishermen slept nearby beneath folded blankets. Inside villages along the river, the air remained warm despite the late hour. Families rested together in crowded homes where the smells of smoke, bread, oil, and damp clay still lingered softly after the evening meal. Somewhere, someone coughed in the darkness. Somewhere else, a baby shifted beside its mother before settling once more into sleep. The sounds of ordinary life continued quietly through the night. But inside the tomb, no living sound remained at all. The burial chamber rested beneath layers of stone in complete darkness. The air felt heavy and unmoving there. Even the smell of incense from the funeral ceremonies had nearly faded now into the dry stillness surrounding the sarcophagus. The mummy remained untouched. The gold funerary mask covered the face with calm and perfect stillness. Its polished surface could no longer reflect torchlight or sunlight. Darkness wrapped around it completely. Nearby, carved wooden statues stood waiting silently beside offering jars and painted chests. One statue showed a servant carrying baskets. Another held a water jar. Another gripped a farming tool across narrow shoulders. Tiny eternal workers prepared to labor endlessly in place of the dead. The craftsmen who carved such figures often worked in small crowded workshops near the riverbanks. Wood shavings covered their floors. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight entering from open doorways. Children sometimes sat nearby watching fathers and uncles shape wood with careful hands. The work demanded patience. A wrong cut could split the wood. A careless brush stroke could ruin painted details added later. Many craftsmen earned little despite long hours of skilled labor. Their fingers cracked from dryness. Their backs hurt from bending over work for entire days. Yet their creations sometimes entered royal tombs where they might survive untouched for centuries beneath the desert. Outside the sealed chamber, deep within the mountain corridors, darkness stretched endlessly toward the blocked entrance passage. The tomb itself felt almost asleep. The air no longer carried the warmth left behind by funeral torches and human bodies. Stone walls slowly absorbed everything into silence. In some corners, faint dust already gathered where no dust had rested before. Tiny changes. Slow changes. The kind that happened quietly over years. Time moved differently underground. Above the valley, stars crossed slowly through the night sky. The guard beside the fire rubbed tired eyes and listened to the wind. He often wondered about the people buried inside the tombs he protected. Not the treasures. Not the gold. The people themselves. He imagined them once alive beneath the same stars. Walking palace courtyards. Speaking with servants. Listening to musicians during evening meals. Resting beside open windows while warm river air drifted through linen curtains. Death turned everyone silent eventually. Kings. Farmers. Children. Scribes. The tombs beneath the cliffs held thousands of quiet endings hidden beneath stone. And still the living world continued above them. Near dawn, the air beside the Nile grew cooler again. Temple servants awakened first in many cities and towns. Bare feet crossed cold stone floors while oil lamps flickered through dark corridors lined with painted columns and carved statues. Morning rituals required preparation. Water carried from sacred pools. Incense lit carefully. Offerings arranged before shrines. Temples in Egypt followed rhythms older than memory itself. Priests shaved their bodies clean. Linen garments were washed carefully. Sacred words repeated exactly as tradition demanded. Everything depended upon order. The rising sun. The flooding river. The movement of stars. The prayers spoken each morning. The Egyptians believed order protected the world from falling into chaos. Even tombs reflected this belief. Objects arranged carefully. Walls painted with proper scenes. Bodies preserved correctly. Nothing left to accident if it could be controlled. And so beneath the western mountain, the sealed burial chamber rested in perfect stillness and order. At last, faint gray light touched the eastern horizon beyond the Nile. The stars slowly faded. Birds stirred among the reeds. The first fishermen pushed boats once more into the calm river water while mist drifted low across the banks. Morning returned to Egypt again. The guards in the valley stood slowly from beside their dying fires. One stretched aching shoulders while another stamped sand from worn sandals. Soon workers would arrive. Soon the cliffs would echo again with distant hammer strikes from unfinished tombs deeper in the valley. But around the sealed burial chamber, silence would remain. As sunlight spread across the land, villages beside the Nile slowly awakened fully. Children carried water jars toward canals. Women swept dust from courtyards. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shades. The smell of fresh bread drifted once again through narrow streets warmed by the early sun. A potter sat beside his wheel shaping wet clay into storage jars while his young son watched nearby. Their workshop stood close enough to the river that cool morning air still reached them before the heat arrived. The potter's hands moved almost without thought after so many years. Press. Turn. Lift. Smooth. Simple movements repeated thousands of times through a lifetime. Some jars he made would hold grain. Some oil. Some beer. And some perhaps would someday rest inside tombs beneath the western cliffs. Death touched every profession in Egypt eventually. Carpenters built coffins. Stonecutters shaped burial chambers. Weavers prepared linen wrappings. Farmers supplied funeral feasts and offerings. Even children understood the journey westward after death. The western desert held enormous importance in Egyptian life because the sun itself disappeared there every evening. Watching the sun sink beyond the cliffs each night felt connected to the journey of the dead into darkness before rebirth with the morning light. And so cemeteries spread across the western lands beyond the river. Silent cities for the dead facing the living world across the Nile. Inside one newly sealed tomb among those silent places, painted stars covered the ceiling above the sarcophagus. Blue paint. Gold details. Tiny white points carefully added by artists crouched beneath oil lamps many months earlier. The painters had likely worked in silence during those final details. Such delicate work required steady hands and careful attention. Sweat may have rolled down their faces while lamp smoke drifted across the unfinished chamber. Outside, life continued around them. Donkeys braying. Workers arguing. Children laughing in dusty streets. Yet underground, the painters created eternal night skies hidden forever from sunlight. As the day grew hotter outside once more, the burial chamber remained cool and dark beneath the mountain. No one entered. No sound disturbed the stillness. The flowers beside the offering tables continued drying slowly in the sealed air. Their petals curled inward. Their scent faded almost completely now. The bread offerings hardened further. Wooden furniture released faint traces of cedar and resin into the darkness. Everything inside the tomb aged together in silence. And beyond the western cliffs, the Nile flowed steadily onward beneath the growing heat of another Egyptian day while ordinary people worked, rested, worried, laughed softly, and lived their brief lives beneath the endless sun. The heat of the afternoon settled over Egypt once more. It arrived slowly, like a heavy cloth laid across the land. Fields near the Nile grew quiet again as workers paused beneath whatever shade they could find. The sun pressed down on rooftops, stone walls, and dusty roads until even movement felt heavier. Along the river, water shimmered brightly. Small waves caught the light and broke it into soft reflections that moved across the muddy banks. Reeds bent gently in the breeze. A few birds stood still in shallow water, waiting for insects to drift close enough. In villages, daily life continued at a slower pace. A pot of stew simmered quietly in one courtyard, releasing a soft smell of lentils and onions. A child slept nearby on a woven mat, one arm stretched out into the warm air. In another home, an old woman sorted grain carefully, removing small stones by hand before setting it aside for later grinding. Life in Egypt often followed this rhythm. Work in the morning. Rest in the heat. Work again when the air cooled. And always, beneath everything, the presence of the river. The Nile was never far from thought. It shaped every road, every field, every settlement along its banks. Even those who never traveled far from their village understood its importance deeply. Without it, the land would become silent desert. And yet, beyond the green edges of the river, the desert always waited. Still. Endless. Patient. In that desert, the burial valleys lay quiet beneath the western cliffs. And deep inside one sealed tomb, the silence remained unchanged. The burial chamber felt far removed from the heat above. Stone walls held a steady coolness. The air inside was dry and still, carrying only faint traces of resin, linen, and old incense. Nothing moved. Nothing entered. Nothing left. The mummy lay at the center of the chamber within its heavy sarcophagus, wrapped carefully in layers of linen that had been pressed and folded with great care during the burial rituals. Time outside no longer reached it in any direct way. Only slow, invisible change continued. Wood dried a little more. Painted surfaces settled further into stillness. Organic offerings continued their quiet transformation into dust. The Egyptians believed such a place was not empty, but complete. A sealed world prepared for eternity. Around the sarcophagus, painted scenes continued their silent existence. Farmers bending over fields. Servants carrying food and water. Boats moving through calm waters beneath painted skies. These images were not meant to be looked at in the usual sense anymore. They were meant to function beyond sight, continuing their purpose even in darkness. Life without interruption. Work without exhaustion. Comfort without end. Outside, the valley guards changed their positions again as the sun moved across the sky. One guard walked slowly along a narrow path between tomb entrances, his spear resting loosely in his hand. Dust rose lightly with each step. He paused near a shaded rock and looked toward the sealed tomb once more. Everything still appeared untouched. Yet the desert always demanded attention. Even when nothing seemed to happen, the guards knew that silence did not always mean safety. Wind could uncover hidden entrances. Sand could shift. Time itself could wear away seals if enough years passed. He adjusted his grip on the spear and continued walking. Nearby, another guard drank water from a clay jar, letting a small portion spill onto his hand before rubbing it across his face. The water was warm already, heated by the afternoon sun. Far beyond the cliffs, the Nile continued its steady movement. Boats passed slowly from one village to another carrying grain, pottery, linen, and small groups of travelers. The river was both road and lifeline. It connected distant parts of Egypt like a long, living thread. Along its banks, scribes worked inside shaded rooms recording deliveries and calculating grain supplies. Their reed pens moved carefully across sheets of papyrus laid flat on wooden tables. Ink dried quickly in the warm air. Many scribes came from families that valued education. Learning to read and write offered a path away from physical labor. It did not remove hardship completely, but it changed its form. Instead of lifting stone or carrying water, scribes spent long hours sitting quietly, copying numbers, recording names, and maintaining records for temples, estates, and officials. Even their work was tiring in its own way. Eyes strained from hours of focus. Hands cramped from steady writing. Backs stiff from sitting too long in one position. Still, many saw it as a more stable life than farming or construction. And yet, regardless of occupation, all Egyptians eventually shared the same fate beneath the earth. Tombs waited for everyone in some form. Large or small. Simple or richly decorated. The belief in an afterlife tied every social class together beneath shared expectations of burial and memory. Inside the sealed tomb, the air remained unchanged through the afternoon. No breeze. No temperature shift from outside heat. Only a slow, quiet settling of everything within the chamber. The offerings placed beside the dead had now changed noticeably from their original state. Bread had become dry and brittle. Fruit had shrunk further, its surface darkening slightly in the absence of moisture. Flowers had nearly collapsed into fragile shapes of their former beauty. Yet none of it disappeared. Nothing left the tomb. Everything remained within its sealed space. The Egyptians often imagined this kind of preservation as important. What was placed with care should remain with care. Even decay, in such places, followed a quiet and orderly path. Outside, late afternoon light began to soften across the valley. Shadows lengthened along the cliff faces where tomb entrances dotted the stone like dark, silent openings. The wind picked up slightly, carrying fine grains of sand that moved gently across the ground in thin drifting lines. A group of workers passed in the distance carrying tools back toward their village. Their voices were low, almost tired. One man leaned slightly on a wooden staff as he walked, favoring one leg that had been strained during labor underground. They did not stop near the sealed tomb. It was not part of their work anymore. That responsibility belonged to the guards now. As evening approached once more, the temperature slowly began to fall. The desert released the heat it had stored throughout the day. Rocks cooled gradually. The air became easier to breathe. A faint breeze moved between the cliffs, brushing against stone surfaces and carrying the scent of dry earth. The guards prepared their fires again. Wood cracked softly as flames rose. Smoke drifted upward into the deepening sky. One guard sat quietly watching the valley while the other checked the seals near several nearby tombs. Everything remained in order. The newly sealed tomb still showed no sign of disturbance. For a moment, the guard simply stood there, looking at the entrance, listening to the wind. There was nothing to hear. No sound from within. No movement beneath the stone. Only silence layered upon silence. He turned away eventually and walked back toward the fire. Above him, stars began appearing once more across the darkening sky. And far beneath the mountain, inside the sealed burial chamber untouched by light, the dead continued resting in perfect stillness while another calm Egyptian night slowly returned over the Nile Valley. Night returned gently over Egypt, as it always did. There was no sharp moment when day ended and night began. Instead, the light simply softened, then faded, until the land rested beneath a deep blue sky filled with distant stars. Along the Nile, the river reflected that sky in long, broken lines of silver. Water moved slowly past reed beds and quiet banks where fishing boats now rested, tied securely for the night. The ropes creaked faintly when the current shifted. Villages grew calm again. Cooking fires dimmed into glowing embers. Lanterns inside homes were lowered or covered. People settled into sleep after another long day of labor and heat. Some still remained awake for a while. A father sat outside his home beside a clay jar of water, listening to distant sounds across the fields. A woman quietly mended cloth under a dim oil lamp, her fingers moving slowly through familiar work. A young boy lay awake for a moment watching shadows shift along the ceiling before drifting off to sleep. Then, little by little, everything grew still. The Nile Valley became a place of soft darkness and quiet breath. And far away, beyond the cultivated land and the scattered villages, the western desert stretched out beneath the night sky. The burial valley lay there in silence. Its cliffs rose like dark shapes against the stars. Between them, narrow paths led toward sealed entrances cut into the stone tombs belonging to generations of people whose lives had once moved through the same river world, now resting quietly in sleep. The guards kept watch. Their fires burned low, casting warm circles of light against the cold ground. Beyond those circles, everything turned into shadow. One guard shifted his position and pulled his cloak closer around his shoulders. The desert night carried a sharp chill that reminded him how quickly warmth disappeared once the sun was gone. He listened carefully. Wind moved through the valley in faint, passing waves. Sand whispered softly along stone surfaces. Occasionally, a distant call of an animal echoed between the cliffs, then faded again into silence. He had grown used to these sounds. They belonged to the desert. But beneath them, there was always something else. Stillness. The kind of stillness that felt deeper than sound itself. He looked toward the newly sealed tomb again. The entrance was unchanged. Fresh plaster still covered the blocking stones. The royal seal impressions remained clear under moonlight. No cracks. No disturbance. No sign that anything had moved since the burial was completed. Inside, of course, nothing could be seen. Only darkness waited behind stone. The guard imagined it briefly not as something frightening, but as something endless. A place where time no longer mattered in the way it did above ground. No rising sun. No heat of afternoon. No cold of night. Only silence continuing without interruption. Inside the tomb, that silence was absolute. The burial chamber remained sealed in perfect stillness. The mummy rested within the sarcophagus, wrapped in linen that had already begun its slow, natural settling into dryness. Gold ornaments remained unmoving beneath layers of cloth. The face, hidden beneath its funerary mask, no longer belonged to the world of living expressions. It belonged to memory. Around the chamber, offerings continued their quiet transformation. Bread had grown hard enough to crack. Fruit had darkened and shriveled further. Flower petals had nearly lost their shape entirely. Yet nothing decayed quickly. Everything slowed inside the sealed space, as though the tomb itself held time in a gentle, unmoving grip. Painted scenes on the walls remained vivid. The colors had not yet faded. The blues still suggested water. The greens still suggested reeds and gardens. The red still suggested earth and skin and life. Servants, farmers, and animals remained frozen in endless motion, continuing tasks that would never end and never require rest. This was how the ancient Egyptians preserved continuity. Life was meant to continue. Not stop. Not disappear. Simply shift into another form. Outside, the guard finally stood and walked a short distance along the edge of the valley. The fire behind him flickered in the wind. Another guard remained seated, staring into the flames without speaking. The night felt long, but familiar. Most nights in the desert were the same. Watchful, quiet, uneventful. And yet, every sealed tomb held the possibility of hidden stories beneath its stone. Not in the sense of action or movement, but in the sense of everything that had been placed inside it by human hands. A life once lived. A household once filled with sound. A voice once speaking names that now belonged only to memory. The valley did not answer such thoughts. It only held them in silence. Far beyond the cliffs, the Nile continued its steady journey through the land. In the dark water, reflections of stars trembled gently with each slow movement of the current. The river never paused. It never hesitated. It simply flowed through Egypt, linking all places together with quiet persistence. And along its banks, life continued even in the deepest hours of night. A small group of fishermen prepared lines by lantern light, speaking in low voices about the morning catch. A temple gatekeeper adjusted a wooden latch before sitting down again beside a stone wall. A traveling merchant rested beneath a cart, wrapped in a thin blanket while waiting for dawn to continue his journey. Everywhere, life moved in cycles. Rest and labor. Silence and sound. Light and darkness. Inside the sealed tomb beneath the western mountain, however, those cycles no longer reached. There was only one state there now. Stillness without change. No waking. No sleeping. No passing of hours in any recognizable sense. Only the quiet presence of what had been carefully placed within stone and left to remain. As the night deepened further, the air in the valley grew colder. The guards tended their fire again, adding small pieces of wood so the flames would not die completely. The light flickered across their faces, revealing tired eyes and dust-covered skin. One of them spoke briefly, but softly, about the coming days. Work would continue. New tombs still needed watching. Supplies would need carrying. Orders would come from officials stationed closer to the river. Life in the burial valley never truly stopped. Only changed in small ways, day by day, night by night. Above them, stars drifted slowly across the sky. Time passed quietly. And beneath the mountain, the sealed tomb remained exactly as it had been since the moment the last stone was placed into position and the final rituals were spoken. Undisturbed. Unchanged. Held in deep, ancient silence while Egypt slept on beside the endless river that carried its life forward through the darkness toward another waiting morning. The hours before dawn were always the quietest in Egypt. Even the wind seemed to soften during that time, as if the entire land held its breath for a moment before the return of light. The stars above the desert burned steadily, cold and distant, scattered across a sky so wide it felt endless. In the burial valley, the guards remained close to their fires. One of them had fallen into a light sleep sitting upright, his spear resting loosely across his lap. The other stayed awake longer, watching the darkness between the cliffs where tomb entrances disappeared into shadow. Nothing moved there. Only the slow shifting of sand in places where the wind touched the ground. The newly sealed tomb remained unchanged. Its entrance was still sealed with plaster and stone, bearing the marks of authority pressed carefully into the surface. Those marks carried meaning, names, power, protection meant to warn and preserve at the same time. But in the stillness of night, even those symbols felt quiet. Beyond the valley, the Nile continued flowing through the sleeping land. Its waters carried reflections of stars and faint hints of movement along its surface. Somewhere downstream, a wooden boat drifted slowly while its owner rested inside, trusting the river to hold it steady until morning. Along the banks, reeds bent softly in the wind. A heron stood motionless in shallow water, its body barely visible in the darkness, waiting for the first movement of fish beneath the surface. The river never truly stopped. Even in night, even in silence, it continued its journey northward through Egypt. And it was this river that had shaped everything the valley now held. The tombs carved into the western cliffs were built by people who lived beside that water. Their food, their tools, their clothing, even the clay that formed their homes all came from the world the Nile sustained. Inside one such tomb, now sealed and hidden beneath stone, that entire world had been gathered and preserved. The burial chamber remained in perfect darkness. No torchlight had entered since the final ceremonies ended. No footsteps had crossed its floor. No voice had disturbed its air. The silence there was not temporary. It was complete. The mummy lay within the sarcophagus, wrapped in linen layers that had already begun to settle into the shape of time. The gold mask over the face remained still and expressionless, catching no light, reflecting nothing. Around it, objects placed carefully during burial remained in their positions. Chests of clothing. Ceremonial items. Small carved figures meant to serve in eternity. Each object had once belonged to the world of movement and touch. Hands had carried them. Eyes had chosen them. Lives had been shaped around them. Now they rested in a place where movement no longer reached. In one corner of the chamber, painted figures continued their endless tasks. A servant bent forever toward a basket. A boat drifted forever across painted water. A field stretched forever beneath a painted sky. The artists who created these scenes worked in quiet concentration during their lives. They often labored inside narrow chambers where light came only from small oil lamps. The air could grow thick and warm, and dust from plaster clung to skin and clothing. Still, they painted carefully. Every line mattered. Every color carried meaning. What they created was not meant to fade quickly. It was meant to remain as long as stone itself remained. Outside, in the burial valley, the night reached its deepest point. The guard who had stayed awake finally rose and stretched his stiff legs. He walked a short distance away from the fire, rubbing his hands together to bring warmth back into them. The cold air pressed against his face. He looked up toward the cliffs again. Everything remained as it had been. The tomb entrances were silent. The newly sealed doorway showed no change. Yet something about the stillness always felt heavy in the deepest part of the night. Not frightening exactly, but present in a way that could not be ignored. He had seen many tombs in his years of service. Old ones and new ones. Some large enough to belong to high officials. Some small and simple, carved for ordinary people. All of them shared the same final condition. Silence. He turned back toward the fire and sat down again, letting the warmth slowly return to his hands. Far away along the Nile, the first faint signs of approaching dawn began to appear. The sky at the horizon shifted slightly, turning from deep black into a softer gray blue. Birds that had been silent through the night began to stir again among reeds and palm trees. A new day was forming. Not yet fully present, but already arriving. In villages along the river, people would soon begin waking again. Bread would be baked. Water carried. Animals led out toward fields. Work would begin once more under the rising sun. But beneath the western mountain, none of that mattered. Inside the sealed tomb, time did not respond to sunrise or sunset. It did not respond to hunger or rest. It did not respond to movement outside its stone boundaries. Only stillness existed there. The mummy remained within its layered linen wrapping, unchanged in position or presence. The offerings placed nearby had continued their slow transformation into dryness and quiet decay, but even that process was gentle, contained, and undisturbed. The tomb did not reject change. It simply slowed everything within it. As if the world had been carefully placed into deep sleep beneath the earth. Outside, the sky brightened further. The guards began to prepare for the next shift. One of them stirred the fire so it would not go out completely, then looked once more toward the valley entrance before turning away. The desert would grow warm again soon. Another day would begin. And the cycle of labor, rest, and silence would continue as it always had beside the Nile. But beneath the cliffs, sealed within stone, the burial chamber remained unchanged. Holding its quiet contents in darkness. Waiting without awareness of passing time. Resting in a stillness that would continue long after the guards, the river, and even the valley itself had changed countless times above it. Morning arrived again over Egypt, gentle and unhurried, as if the world simply drifted back into light. The sky above the Nile slowly changed from pale gray to soft gold. The river caught that light and spread it across its surface in long, trembling reflections. Birds moved in small groups over the water, calling softly as they searched for food among the reeds. Villages began to wake. Smoke rose once more from cooking fires tucked inside courtyards and between narrow homes. The smell of fresh bread returned, warm and familiar. Clay jars were filled with water carried from canals that ran quietly through the fields. People stepped out into the early sunlight, adjusting to another day that felt much like the one before it. A farmer walked slowly toward his land, carrying a wooden tool over his shoulder. His steps were steady, unhurried. The soil he tended depended on the river, and he depended on the soil. That simple connection shaped his entire life. Nearby, a group of workers repaired a small irrigation channel. Water slipped carefully through the newly cleared path, dark and steady, bringing life back into the waiting ground. No one spoke much. Morning work was often done in quiet rhythm. Everything in Egypt moved with repetition. Work returned. Rest returned. The river returned. Even grief, over time, became part of that rhythm. And far beyond the river, beyond the green fields and villages, the western cliffs still stood in silence. The burial valley remained unchanged beneath the growing light. The guards had completed another shift, and new watchers now took their place. One man stood near a shaded rock, scanning the entrances carved into the stone. Another walked slowly along the familiar paths between tombs, checking seals and listening to the desert wind. The newly sealed tomb remained undisturbed. Its entrance still held the same smooth surface of plaster and stone, pressed into place during the funeral days earlier. The marks of authority remained visible under daylight now, no longer touched by torchlight but by the pale strength of the morning sun. Inside, however, there was no difference between morning and night. No shift in color. No change in air. No awareness of time passing above. The burial chamber remained enclosed in its deep, dry stillness. The mummy lay within its sarcophagus, wrapped carefully in linen that had already begun its slow transformation into permanence. The layers pressed gently into themselves as time continued its quiet work without sound or motion. Gold rested across the face, unmoving. The painted eyes of the funerary mask looked outward into nothing, seeing nothing, reflecting nothing. Yet within Egyptian belief, such objects were not empty. They held presence, protection, and meaning beyond physical sight. Around the chamber, offerings continued their slow, quiet change. Bread had hardened further, now fragile at its edges. Fruit had darkened into deep, dry shapes that no longer resembled their original softness. Flowers had collapsed almost entirely, leaving only traces of petals pressed against stone. Nothing in the tomb disappeared quickly. Everything changed slowly, as if even decay respected the silence of the sealed space. Along the walls, painted scenes remained vivid. A river scene stretched endlessly across one surface, showing boats moving through calm water beneath a wide sky. On another wall, fields of grain bent under invisible wind. Workers stood frozen in eternal harvest, their movements paused forever at the peak of labor. These images were not decoration alone. They were continuity. A way of keeping life present where physical life had ended. Outside, the day continued to grow warmer. By mid-morning, sunlight spread fully across the Nile Valley. Fields brightened into deep green and gold. The river shimmered steadily as boats moved along its surface carrying goods, people, and messages between settlements. In one village, a scribe sat beneath a shaded structure carefully recording grain deliveries. His reed pen moved across papyrus in steady lines. He paused occasionally to dip it into ink, then continued writing without looking up for long. Around him, daily life moved quietly. A woman carried a basket of dates. A child followed behind her, barefoot and curious. A group of men rested near a wall, drinking water and speaking softly about the heat that would come later in the afternoon. Nothing felt unusual. Everything felt familiar. And yet, in the distance, beyond the green edge of life, the desert waited with the same patience it always held. Inside the burial valley, the guards continued their watch. The sun was higher now, warming the stone surfaces of the cliffs. Shadows had shortened, but the heat had not yet reached its full strength. Dust moved lightly across the ground whenever the wind shifted. One guard paused near the sealed tomb and looked at it for a long moment. There was nothing to see that was new. No cracks. No movement. No disturbance. Only the same sealed surface that had been there since the final rituals were completed. Still, he remained for a moment longer than necessary, as many guards did. The presence of tombs created a feeling that was difficult to name. Not fear. Not comfort. Something quieter than both. A sense of finality. He eventually turned away and continued walking. The valley remained secure. Above, life beside the Nile continued its steady flow through the day. Fishermen adjusted nets along the riverbanks. Farmers guided animals through narrow paths between fields. Bakers worked near ovens that now grew too warm to stand beside for long periods. Even children slowed their play as the heat increased. Afternoons in Egypt often brought stillness. Not silence like the tomb, but a living pause. A slowing of movement under the weight of the sun. And in that slowing world above, the sealed tomb remained untouched below. Inside its stone walls, nothing responded to the heat outside. No warmth entered. No breeze reached. Only the faint, unchanged air of the burial chamber continued its quiet existence around the resting dead. Time passed there differently. Not faster. Not slower. Simply without awareness of itself. As the afternoon light deepened, shadows returned again toward the edges of buildings and trees. The Nile caught the beginning of evening reflection, its surface softening as the sun moved lower in the sky. Another day slowly prepared to end. But beneath the western mountain, the tomb did not notice evening approaching. It did not notice the cooling of the air. It did not notice the return of stars that would soon rise again above the valley. It remained sealed in the same deep stillness it had held since the final stone was placed and the last footsteps of mourners disappeared into the desert path. And in that stillness, nothing changed at all. Evening returned gently to Egypt, as it always did, without hurry and without noise. The sun lowered itself toward the western horizon, sinking slowly behind the desert cliffs that stood beyond the Nile. Light softened across the land, turning the fields into warm shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched between trees, across canals, and over quiet village paths. The river reflected the sky as it changed. Gold becoming orange. Orange becoming pale red. Then slowly fading into blue. Along the banks, people finished their last tasks of the day. Nets were gathered. Tools were set aside. Water jars were carried back toward homes. The sound of footsteps on dirt paths became softer as the day's labor came to an end. Cooking fires began to appear again in courtyards. Smoke rose gently upward, carrying the smell of grain, lentils, and baked bread into the cooling air. Families gathered close, speaking in low voices about the work of the day, the heat they endured, and the quiet hopes of the next morning. Some children already lay half asleep beside their mothers. Others still sat awake for a little longer, watching the sky darken and listening to distant sounds across the village. Egypt at evening always felt like a place returning to itself. Not changing. Only settling. And far beyond the river, the western desert grew cooler as night approached. The burial valley once again entered its familiar rhythm of watchfulness. The guards moved carefully between tomb entrances, their silhouettes stretching across the stone ground as torchlight and firelight returned. The flames were small but steady, pushing back the growing darkness in soft circles. One guard stopped briefly near the newly sealed tomb. He looked at it without speaking. The entrance remained undisturbed, its plastered surface still smooth beneath the fading daylight. No signs of wind damage. No footprints near the base. No changes at all since the last patrol. He adjusted his grip on his spear and continued walking. The valley remained secure. Above them, the first stars of evening appeared again in the sky. They came slowly at first, faint and distant, then gradually filled the darkness until the desert sky became crowded with light. The Milky Way stretched faintly overhead like a soft path across the heavens. And beneath that sky, the cliffs stood unchanged. Inside the sealed tomb, there was no awareness of evening at all. No fading of light. No cooling of air. No transition from day to night. Only the same deep stillness that had filled the chamber since the moment the burial was completed. The sarcophagus remained at the center of the chamber, heavy and unmoving. Its stone surface held the weight of time without showing any visible change. Within it, the wrapped body rested in perfect stillness. Linen layers remained tightly folded around the form, shaped by careful hands during the embalming rituals that had taken place days before burial. Resin and oils had long since dried into the cloth, binding it into a preserved state that resisted the passing of time. The funerary mask still covered the face, silent and unchanging, reflecting no light, responding to no presence. Around the chamber, the objects placed for eternity remained exactly where they had been left. Offering tables stood with hardened remnants of food. Wooden chests rested closed, their contents untouched. Small statues of servants and workers stood in their eternal positions, waiting to perform tasks that would never need to begin. The painted walls continued their endless scenes. A river flowed forever across stone. Farmers worked forever in fields that would never rest. Boats moved forever beneath a sky that never changed. The Egyptians believed such images were not simply decoration, but continuation. A way for life to persist beyond physical limits. A way for order to remain even after the body had entered the stillness of death. Outside, night deepened across the Nile Valley. The villages grew quiet once more. Lanterns were lowered or extinguished. People lay down to sleep after another full day of work. The sounds of Egypt softened into the familiar silence of nighttime life. And beyond the river, in the western desert, the burial valley entered its watchful calm. The guards tended their fires. The wind moved gently through stone corridors. Sand shifted in small, almost invisible patterns across the ground. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet beneath that ordinariness lay the constant presence of the tombs themselves. Structures built not for movement, but for permanence. Inside one such tomb, sealed carefully beneath layers of stone, the air remained unchanged. The burial chamber held its quiet balance. No movement disturbed it. No sound entered it. No light reached it. Even the offerings, now fully dried, remained exactly where they had been placed. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had fallen. Nothing had shifted. Time inside the chamber did not feel like passing hours. It felt like suspension. As if the entire space had been placed gently outside of ordinary existence and left there to rest. The dead lay within that stillness, wrapped in linen, protected by stone, surrounded by painted images of life that would never fade. Above, the stars continued their slow journey across the sky. The guards changed positions again during the night, their movements quiet and familiar. One man added wood to the fire while another walked along the edge of the valley, listening to the wind pass between the cliffs. There was nothing unusual. Nothing disturbed. Only the steady presence of night in the desert. Far away along the Nile, fishermen tied their boats for the night and lay down beside them, wrapped in thin blankets. A few lanterns still flickered near riverbanks where travelers rested before continuing journeys at dawn. The river kept moving through all of it. Never stopping. Never rushing. Just flowing, as it always had. And beneath the western mountain, the sealed tomb remained exactly as it had been since the moment the final prayers were spoken and the entrance was closed. Still. Complete. Silent beyond measure. Holding within it a world that no longer changed, resting beneath stone while the living world above continued to rise and fall with every passing day beside the endless river of Egypt. The deepest part of the night settled over Egypt like a quiet blanket. By now, even the faint sounds from villages along the Nile had faded almost completely. Fires had burned down to dim embers. Lanterns had been covered or extinguished. Most homes were still and dark, holding sleeping families close together against the night air. Only the river continued its soft movement. The Nile flowed without interruption, reflecting scattered stars that drifted above it. Occasionally, a small ripple passed along its surface where fish moved beneath the water or where a drifting boat shifted slightly in its rope. Along the western desert, the burial valley rested in silence. The guards remained awake, though their movements were slower now. Fatigue pressed gently on their bodies after long hours of watching. One leaned against a rock, eyes half closed but still aware. Another walked a short path between tomb entrances, repeating the same familiar route again and again. The firelight flickered low, casting shifting shadows across stone. Every entrance carved into the cliffs appeared still and unchanged. Some belonged to older burials, their surfaces worn by time and wind. Others were newer, still sharp in detail, still holding the marks of recent ritual and sealing. And among them stood the newly sealed tomb. Unchanged. Undisturbed. Quiet beneath the weight of stone and desert night. Inside, there was no sense of outside time. No awareness of night. No awareness of the guards. No awareness of the river beyond the cliffs. The burial chamber remained enclosed in its own world of stillness. The air inside was dry and unmoving, carrying only the faint presence of materials placed there during burial: resin, linen, wood, dried flowers, and stone. Nothing entered. Nothing left. The sarcophagus remained at the center of the chamber, heavy and silent. Within it, the wrapped body lay in perfect stillness, preserved by careful preparation and sealed space. The linen layers held their shape without change. The funerary mask remained fixed, expressionless, facing into darkness that did not shift or fade. Around the chamber, objects placed for eternity remained exactly where they had been arranged. Chests closed. Offering tables still. Statues of servants waiting. Everything preserved in the arrangement chosen by the living before the tomb was sealed. The Egyptians believed that order itself helped protect existence beyond death. Disorder belonged to the world outside. Inside the tomb, everything was meant to remain arranged, stable, and complete. Even silence had structure here. Outside, the night continued its slow movement toward dawn. The stars drifted across the sky in their long, patient paths. The desert cooled further, and the air in the valley grew sharper, carrying faint traces of sand and stone. One of the guards stoked the fire again, breaking small pieces of wood and placing them carefully into the embers. Sparks rose briefly before fading into darkness above. He glanced toward the sealed tomb without thinking too deeply about it. It was part of his duty to check it. Part of his routine. But like all routines in the valley, it carried a quiet familiarity. Over time, even the presence of tombs became something expected. Something steady. Something always there. He turned away and continued his watch. Far beyond the cliffs, the Nile kept flowing. Near its banks, a few fishermen already prepared for the coming morning, even though night still held the land. They checked their nets quietly, fingers moving with practiced care. One man sat beside his boat, resting for a moment before sleep, listening to the soft water against wood. In villages, the first hints of early movement would soon begin. Bakers rising before dawn. Water carriers preparing jars. Animals shifting in their pens. Egypt always moved forward in cycles. Rest, then work. Darkness, then light. Stillness, then motion. But beneath the western mountain, the sealed tomb did not follow those cycles. Inside the burial chamber, nothing changed with the passage of hours above. The offerings continued their slow, almost imperceptible transformation into dryness and dust. Bread became more fragile. Fruit darkened further. Flowers collapsed completely into delicate remnants pressed against stone. Yet nothing disappeared. Everything remained contained within the sealed space. The painted walls continued their endless scenes without interruption. Fields remained forever harvested. Water remained forever flowing. Servants remained forever moving through tasks that never ended and never required completion. The world inside the tomb was complete in its stillness. Not alive. Not dead in the ordinary sense. But preserved in a state that did not belong to the living world outside. As the night reached its final hours, the desert grew colder still. The guards wrapped themselves more tightly against the chill. One sat near the dying fire, staring into the embers as if searching for warmth that had already faded. The valley was quiet. No movement disturbed the sand. No sound carried between the cliffs except the faint whisper of wind. Then, slowly, far in the distance, the sky began to change. A thin line of lighter color appeared at the edge of the horizon, barely visible at first. The stars closest to it began to fade, their brightness softening as dawn prepared to return. Another day was forming. But it had not yet arrived. The world still rested in between. In villages along the Nile, people would soon begin waking again. Another round of bread would be baked. Another round of water carried. Another round of labor under the rising sun. Life would continue as it always did. Unbroken. Steady. Familiar. And beneath the western cliffs, inside the sealed tomb, the same stillness remained unchanged. No awareness of night turning to morning. No awareness of time passing above stone. Only the quiet presence of everything placed there at the moment of burial, held in perfect silence beneath the desert while Egypt slowly moved toward another sunrise along the endless river. The first light of dawn came softly over Egypt, as if it had been there all along, only waiting to be noticed. The eastern sky brightened slowly, turning from deep gray to pale gold. Stars faded one by one, disappearing into the growing light above the Nile Valley. The air grew slightly warmer, but still carried the calm coolness of early morning. In villages along the river, life began again. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But in familiar, quiet steps that had repeated for generations. A baker stirred in his sleep before rising to feed the fire beneath his oven. The first smell of bread began to drift through narrow streets once more. A woman carried water from a canal, her footsteps soft on damp earth. A man led a donkey toward the fields, its hooves tapping gently against the packed ground. Children woke slowly, rubbing sleep from their eyes as the sounds of morning gathered around them. The Nile reflected the new light in long, shimmering lines. Water moved steadily, carrying the memory of stars that had just disappeared. And beyond the river, beyond the green fields and early activity of the villages, the western desert remained still. The burial valley lay quiet beneath the cliffs. The guards continued their watch through the early morning hours, their fires now smaller and less necessary as daylight returned. One guard stood near a rock, stretching stiff limbs. Another walked a slow path between tomb entrances, checking each sealed space as part of routine duty. Everything appeared unchanged. The desert had left no marks during the night. No wind damage. No disturbance of sand. No movement near any entrance. Especially not the newly sealed tomb. Its plastered entrance remained smooth and intact, bearing the same impressions pressed into it during the burial rituals. The surface now caught the faint light of dawn, pale and unbroken. Inside, there was no recognition of morning. No change in brightness. No soft shift from darkness to light. The burial chamber remained in complete separation from the world above. Stone held it firmly in place, enclosing it in a space where time did not respond to sunrise or sunset. The mummy remained within the sarcophagus, wrapped in linen that had already begun its slow transformation into permanence. The layers rested in perfect stillness, shaped by careful human hands and now preserved in silence. The funerary mask covered the face without expression or movement. It did not reflect light. It did not reveal emotion. It simply remained, as it had been placed during burial. Around the chamber, offerings stood where they had been arranged. Tables of food now fully dried. Chests of belongings sealed and still. Small statues of servants waiting in eternal readiness. Everything in its correct position. Everything preserved. The Egyptians believed this arrangement mattered deeply. Order in life ensured order in death. Proper placement ensured continued existence beyond the physical world. Even silence had meaning when placed correctly within ritual space. Outside the tomb, the valley slowly brightened under the rising sun. The cliffs took on warm tones of stone and sand. Shadows shortened and softened. The air became clearer, carrying the dry scent of the desert mixed with faint traces of smoke from last night's fires. Workers began arriving once more. Some carried tools toward unfinished tombs deeper in the valley. Others walked toward supply areas or gathering points where instructions would be given for the day's labor. Stonecutters passed along familiar paths worn smooth by years of movement. Their footsteps echoed lightly between the cliffs. Their conversations remained low and brief. The rhythm of work continued, as it always had in the burial valleys. Carving, shaping, smoothing stone into prepared spaces beneath the earth. Even in the presence of death, life in Egypt never fully stopped. It simply shifted into different forms of effort and purpose. And deep within one of those carved spaces, the newly sealed tomb remained untouched. The guards performed another careful inspection around it as part of routine duty. One knelt briefly to examine the ground near the entrance, checking for disturbances that might have formed overnight. There were none. Only wind-smoothed sand and the faint marks of earlier footsteps from days before. He stood again and moved on. Far beyond the valley, the Nile continued its steady flow through the morning light. Boats traveled along its surface carrying goods between towns and cities. Fishermen cast nets into calm water. Farmers guided animals through fields that had begun to brighten fully under the sun. The river remained the center of everything. It carried life. It carried trade. It carried memory from place to place along its long path through Egypt. And yet, despite all movement above ground, the burial chamber beneath the western mountain remained entirely unchanged. Inside, the air held still. No currents passed through it. No sound entered it. No trace of mourning reached its sealed space. The offerings continued their slow, quiet transformation into dryness and dust. Nothing disappeared, but everything shifted gradually into a more fragile state, as though time itself moved differently within those walls. The painted scenes along the stone continued their endless existence. A river that never stopped flowing. A harvest that never ended. A sky that never changed. These images remained vivid, untouched by light or shadow, preserved in the darkness like memories held carefully against forgetting. Above the valley, the sun climbed higher into the sky. Heat began to return slowly to the desert ground. The guards adjusted their positions as the day became stronger. One drank from a clay jar, the water already warmed by the sun. Another leaned briefly against a rock, resting after the long night shift. The tomb entrances remained quiet. No movement. No disturbance. Only the steady presence of stone carved into the mountain. As the morning continued, workers deeper in the valley resumed their tasks. The sound of tools returned. Soft but steady. Stone meeting stone in slow, controlled rhythm. Dust rose in faint clouds within unfinished chambers. Voices echoed briefly before fading into the tunnels. Life continued beneath the desert as it always did. And beneath all of it, deeper still, the sealed tomb remained in perfect stillness. No awareness of the growing day above. No awareness of labor or movement or sound. Only silence holding everything in place. The mummy rested within its sarcophagus, unchanged since burial. Surrounded by objects carefully chosen to accompany eternity. Held within a space where time no longer behaved as it did in the world above the Nile. And as Egypt moved forward into another ordinary day of work, heat, and quiet repetition, the tomb remained exactly as it had been left. Silent. Complete. And untouched by the passing of another sunrise over the endless river valley. The valley slowly settled into a deeper kind of quiet as the final light of day softened over the western cliffs. The guards no longer moved with urgency. Their footsteps grew lighter, their voices fewer, until even their presence felt like part of the landscape rather than something active within it. The fire near the watchpoint burned low, reduced to glowing embers that shifted gently in the wind. The Nile, far away, continued its steady flow through Egypt, carrying reflections of the last light across its surface. Villages along its banks began to dim once again, one by one, as families turned inward for rest. The familiar rhythm of the land continued: work, pause, sleep, and return, like breath moving through something ancient and living. And beyond all of it, in the western desert, the burial valley remained unchanged. The tomb entrances stood as they always had, carved into stone that had already outlived countless generations. Wind passed through them without meaning, sand drifted without memory, and the cliffs held their silent watch over everything placed within their shadow. The newly sealed tomb remained exactly as it had been since the moment the last ritual was spoken. Inside, there was no evening, no night, no morning waiting to arrive. Only stillness. The burial chamber held its contents in perfect preservation. The sarcophagus remained closed, the linen undisturbed, the offerings unchanged in their quiet transformation. Painted scenes continued their endless, motionless life along the walls, fields that never emptied, rivers that never stopped, figures that never grew tired. Everything within the chamber existed in a state beyond ordinary time, as if the world outside had been gently set aside and left to pass without reaching in. Above ground, Egypt continued its eternal rhythm beside the Nile. Life moved forward in its familiar cycles, shaped by water, sun, labor, and rest. Generations would come and go, and the river would continue carrying them all without pause. But beneath the western mountain, the tomb would remain as it was left. Unchanging. Unaware. Resting in a silence so complete that even time itself seemed to pass without leaving a trace. And in that quiet space, hidden beneath stone and desert, the story of a life was preserved, not in motion, but in stillness, held gently inside the long, enduring sleep of ancient Egypt.